Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 10 of the Stained Glass Podcast. I am your host, Jessica Spurlock. On today's episode, you will hear part 2 of my story dealing with my daughter's illness. Let's get started. As I mentioned in the intro, this is part 2 of a trilogy story series detailing my daughter's illness. If you haven't listened to episode 9 yet, press pause on this episode, listen to that episode first, and then come back and continue listening to this episode. With that, let's continue our story. In the last episode, I mentioned that before we headed to the second hospital, but the third hospital stay, the pediatrician gave us an envelope with all the records and test results. And I kept adding to it every time we got more results. This large envelope was bursting at the seams, and finally it fell apart after a few weeks of toting it around from specialist to specialist. If you've been in my shoes, every time you see a new face in the medical world, they want to hear your story. And there were so many details that I would forget, and so many tests that were repeated that they all started to run together when speaking about them. And since this envelope was already in shambles and disorganized, I took this opportunity to reorganize all of these results into a binder and plotted her absolute eosinophil count onto an Excel chart that also had a timeline of the different medications and hospital stays and symptoms overlaid on this chart. As the week went on, her appetite and energy levels continued to decrease. We had our GI specialist appointment at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, previously scheduled for that week. So we went and we packed a few things in case they would decide to admit her for further testing. My daughter was at rock bottom as far as her illness was concerned. She looked it too. What little hair she had fallen out in patches. She was no longer able to walk upright on her own. Her skin hung off of her tiny, lanky frame where she had lost so much weight. Her bright blue eyes looked sunken in and dim from the fatigue of the whole ordeal. And her absolute eosinophil counts were the highest they had ever been, hitting almost 20,000. Remember from the last episode, normal is 200 to 400. So she was definitely at rock bottom. And I think my husband and I were at rock bottom too at this point. We got to Nationwide Hospital, and it was beautifully decorated in a forest theme with bright colors. There were birds and nature noises playing from the sculptures, and it was really peaceful. Everyone we encountered was so friendly and helpful. We walked over to the GI department and sat down in the room, and the doctor entered. She had been the same doctor who was consulting on her case from the second hospital stay at the local hospital. They did not have any of the results yet from anywhere, so it was a good thing that I brought my binder and my spreadsheet. The doctor pored over the spreadsheet for a few minutes, and she said to me, "Mom, this makes you a rock star. This is such a great way to pictorially represent what has happened with your daughter." And then she closed the book and clasped her hands on her lap. She sighed and asked us a question. "So what do you want us to do?" My husband and I just looked like we were about to cry and stared at each other. The doctor waited a moment and said, "Don't worry. We'll admit your daughter. We're going to find out what's wrong with her." And with that, the appointment was over, and we were headed over to registration to get admitted. And it's a good thing we packed to stay for a few days. And of course, because she had a positive C-tif test in the past, we needed to be in isolation until they can run more tests to clear us. And also, they had a bed in the room for the parents, so I didn't have to sleep in the crib with her. 2 things she told us we'd be admitted for was to have an NG feeding tube placed and to have a scope done of her entire GI tract. My husband and I were very reluctant at first to have this feeding tube placed, and we fought having it done for a couple of days. My thought was that she didn't feel like having a hair bow on her head. A tube sticking out of her nose would be a complete disaster. But after a couple of days in the hospital, she stopped eating completely. It was clear that we needed to have this feeding tube placed. It was torture having it done, but looking back on it, it was a real turning point in her care. She was being fed elemental formula through this feeding tube. And apparently, in order to get a colonoscopy, the preparation stuff adults usually have to drink is instead pumped through the feeding tube. She would have needed to have this done eventually, even if she wasn't formula fed. The real miracle is that she did not mess with it at all. One of the scariest things about hypereosinophilic syndrome is that it can take the shape of any ordinary illness and be silently killing you in the background. And as a parent of a toddler with this illness, you question everything since they can't totally verbalize everything they are feeling. Her initial onset presented with a stomach bug that she couldn't shake. Obviously not the case. While waiting for the bone marrow testing results, they ran all kinds of tests on her from practically every area of the hospital, including oncology, meaning a cancer-like diagnosis was back on the table. The patient transport orderly who escorted us to her heart procedures was making conversation with us about what she had been through. There was no mention of us being Christians or anything like that. But as we were walking down this very long corridor, he turned around and looked at me right in the eyes, and he said, "God's not done with her yet. God always has special plans for these mystery children. He ain't finished, he's only just beginning." It gave me chills. And morning rounds was very interesting. Every department came in, and the head of the department, not a resident, gave their piece, and then they rotated out, and the next department came in. There was like 40 to 50 people at each of these meetings. It was crazy, but in an awesome way. And after 5 days in the hospital, they cleared her to go outside of her hospital room. One of her favorite places was the playroom. She loved it there, and even our amazing nurse would take her to the playroom some days so we could take a break. They also had music therapy classes, and she absolutely loved that. But one by one, the departments came in and said that everything they tested for was within normal limits. So we were able to start crossing things off the differential diagnosis list. We were also waiting on the results of her bone marrow biopsy that my daughter had done at the local hospital a couple weeks prior. Those results should have been in by the time we made it to Nationwide, but they were still pending. We had a Bulldog resident on our case, and she was not intimidated by anyone. She really fought for our daughter. I remember walking by an office on my way from a break and overhearing her get on to someone at the Mayo Clinic about the delayed biopsy results. She was tiny, but she was ruthless, and I was so thankful that she was on our daughter's case. I hope today, after all these years later, that she is still advocating for every patient the way she did our daughter. We finally got the bone marrow biopsy results, and they showed a tremendous amount of eosinophils being produced from the bone marrow. But luckily, it ruled out eosinophilic leukemia and other cancer-like eosinophilic syndromes. I remember being on a conference call with the NIH, Cincinnati Children's, and a hospital in Israel on one of the specialist's cell phones, and they told us that the next thing they wanted our team to do was a scope of the entire GI tract, which was in the plan anyways. So when we had the opportunity to ask questions, I asked a very simple but also an impossibly loaded question. I asked, "What's her prognosis? Is this going to kill her?" And the line got very, very quiet. One of the specialists, I think from the NIH, finally spoke up and he said, "We're not sure." Now, like I said in the previous episode, I can really respect this specialist's answer. It isn't arrogant or overconfident, it was realistic. So later in that evening, they started the preparation for her scope. And she was in diapers, so that was so much fun. The scope went well, and she did fine with the anesthesia. They even let me gown up and accompany her into the procedure room until she was asleep because of all that she had been through. We had just come back into our hospital room at Columbus Nationwide Children's Hospital. The doctors we spoke with in the conference room seemed very happy that we were not dealing with an IBD, Crohn's, celiacs, or colitis. So we were positive and upbeat, and excited because some friends from West Virginia were coming to the hospital to visit us. Our daughter had missed playing with her friends, their children. But a few minutes later, the allergy and immunology doctors came in to talk with us. By crossing off the last few things that could be making her sick, we could tell by their urgent tones and looks on their faces that we were still not out of the woods. They announced that it is very likely that she indeed had hypereosinophilic syndrome, or HES. Nationwide could no longer help us, and my daughter needed to be transferred to Cincinnati Children's for further testing and treatment immediately. They are the experts in her diagnosis. The only other alternative was the National Institute of Health in Baltimore, Maryland. But Cincinnati was only 3.5 hours away from home, and it was a pediatric hospital. I didn't want my daughter to be treated like a lab rat at the NIH. Since it was a Memorial Day weekend, we asked if we can go home for a few days. They agreed. But upon hearing those words of the diagnosis finally spoken, those positive and upbeat feelings from earlier were immediately replaced with fear. Fear of the unknown, mostly. This past holiday season, my daughter was reading the Christmas story in Luke 1. I was struck when she read the words of the angel to Mary, which I'll paraphrase. The angel said, "The Lord is with you, do not be afraid." It felt like deja vu. The Lord reminded me of that scripture, my mind replaying those words to me as the doctors delivered the news of her diagnosis. When Mary received the earth-shattering news of her impending pregnancy, the Lord was with her, so she shouldn't be afraid. When I received the news of her diagnosis, I shouldn't have fear in my heart because the Lord was with us. Now, since it was already after dinner time, we stayed the night at Nationwide and prepared to leave for home the next day. It was the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. Since my daughter was still primarily tube-fed, a man from the medical device company stopped by our room to drop off a feeding tube for us to take home, with enough formula to get us through the weekend before heading to Cincinnati, and also trained us on how to use the feeding pump. The nurses came by to discuss her formula feeding schedule and to say their goodbyes. My daughter had made a lot of friends with the staff during her 2 weeks at Nationwide. My head was spinning with all of these new routines and questions about her quality of life. What was her prognosis? Is this going to kill her? What if I miss a feeding? What happens if she pulls out the feeding tube? What do we look for if there's a problem with it? Will she need to be formula fed forever? What if she never gets to eat Chick-fil-A again? Or as she affectionately called it, bok bok filet. We spent a quiet weekend at home. We set up a feeding station in her room. Since she needed an overnight feeding, I slept on an air mattress on her floor to refill her bag with formula and to listen for any alarms indicating a problem with the pump. We went to the park, we went to church, we went to a barbecue, and then we packed for another week at another hospital. We arrived at Cincinnati Children's Hospital on Tuesday to be monitored during the initial doses of her treatment. But first, for the 4th time, an oncologist walked into our room and we needed to rule out another type of cancer again. This time she needed a PET scan and a CT scan and would need to be under anesthesia again. So the next day we had the PET and the CT scans done, and though she had some intake in her lymphatic system, it wasn't worrisome or what they were looking for. While our experience at Cincinnati during the stay was not nearly as magical as Nationwide, there were some bright spots. We got to meet Olivia's new specialist, and she was amazingly talented and a nice lady. One of the nurses we had also was a believer and told us of a time that she was very sick with mystery virus she had picked up while serving medical missions in Malawi. She was sick for over a year, then got better eventually. The doctors didn't know what she had or how she got better. She gave me hope that even with mystery illnesses, there is always a chance for healing, thanks to God. We found out that the scope she had at Nationwide showed lots of inflammation and eosinophils throughout her GI tract, especially in her esophagus. They ran more tests, including blood work, where the eosinophils were 17,000 at this point. The next day, we started her treatment. The only approved treatment for a patient of my daughter's age, which was 18 months at the time, was heavy oral steroids. Like 3 or 4 times the normal dosage. I can't remember exactly. And what these steroids do is break apart these eosinophils. When the eosinophils break apart, they release toxins into the bloodstream. So the reason our treatment needed to be done inpatient is because my daughter needed to be monitored for sepsis because of the sheer amount of toxins released into the blood in such a short time span could have sent her little body into septic shock. The doctors wanted her cell levels to go down by 50% before sending us home. Hers went down 90% after 1 dose of treatment, with 2,200 eosinophils on the blood work. She also showed no signs of sepsis, so we were sent home. They also coordinated a delivery of formula since she would still need to be tube-fed until she gained enough weight and until her appetite returned to normal. So why did it take so long? Should we have just gone to Cincinnati or Columbus to start with? Well, no. There's a process called a differential diagnosis that needs to be followed in medicine. Basically ruling out what else it could be that's causing the high eosinophils. Eliminating the easy stuff first and working our way to the harder and more rare illnesses at the bottom of the list. And it took a long time to get to the bottom of the list because all of these tests they have take days or even weeks to get the results back. The experts were extremely complimentary of the workup she had in West Virginia. Some folks turn their noses up at the local physicians, and as we experienced with some of them, sometimes it's warranted. But in this case, though, they were very thorough. It had been very hard on us being there in Columbus and Cincinnati for nearly 3 weeks total, about 3 hours from home. And it was so nice being only 20 to 45 minutes away from home at the local hospitals. Friends and family were able to visit us and bring us things. We could go home or to work if we needed anything. We were familiar with the area and could go places. We were stuck at the hospital, but Nationwide worked really hard to make their patients and families as comfortable as possible. To arrive at a diagnosis over the 3-month period we've discussed in our podcast series so far, my daughter had been through 62 blood draws, 8 flow cytometry tests, 7 stool studies, 2 abdominal x-rays, a chest x-ray, a hip x-ray, abdominal ultrasound, an echo, an EKG, bone marrow aspiration, an endoscopy, a colonoscopy, a PET scan, a CT scan, being under anesthesia 4 times, and spending a total of 31 days in the hospital. And through this grueling process, we found out that our daughter does not have a nasty stomach virus, cholera, food allergies, lactose intolerance, protein disorder or FPIES, parasitic infections, leukemia, lymphoma, MDS or other precancerous syndromes, chronic eosinophilic leukemia, Crohn's disease, celiac disease, colitis, other inflammatory bowel disease, and lots of other diseases that can cause eosinophilia that we were just not told about. So what does she have? It's called hypereosinophilic syndrome, or HES. She has the idiopathic type of this disorder associated with the gastrointestinal tract. It took 3 months from the onset of symptoms to get to this initial diagnosis. And that time frame is a testament to the advocacy from her pediatrician, specialists, and her parents. It is so much longer for most people. We weren't really able to settle on that diagnosis until much later, as it takes time to prove it out, and we had to have another endoscopy to rule out eosinophilic GI disorders for good. Her absolute eosinophil count climbed back up after a few days on oral steroids, but not enough to need to go back to Cincinnati. But the good news is that she stopped getting sick once treatment started. Therefore, she gained back all the weight she had lost while being sick, and then an additional 2 pounds. Her appetite wasn't back to normal yet, but it was the pediatrician's thought that it might after the tube was removed. It's not comfortable to eat solid food with a tube going down your throat. So they removed it, and then the case of formula was carted off for a donation, as they can't technically use the open cases for other patients. That was a great day. Soon, her appetite was back to normal. The heavy steroids helped with that. During this time, I had shared a lot of details on Facebook, mostly just asked for prayers, and it was exhausting trying to keep everyone in the loop with private messages wanting more information. So I wrote a blog post and I shared it on Facebook. The next morning, I was waiting on my car to get worked on. I opened up the blog app to fix a few typos that I saw in the post. I was shocked and amazed to see that over 1,100 people had read the post the previous day, and another 100 had read it that morning so far. That was over 1,200 people thinking of and praying for my daughter. God works in amazing ways. The original weaning schedule for the steroids was weekly, taking 4 weeks total. However, we were not able to wean her off the steroids according to that schedule. She did not respond as quickly to the treatment as they had hoped. Progress was made, of course. She was on the highest dose of steroids for a month instead of just a week. They continued to stay the same until the dose was knocked in half. Her numbers went up instead. The remaining levels of steroids were 3 weeks before weaning instead of 1. Her absolute eosinophil counts wouldn't cooperate. My husband and I have not been optimistic or pessimistic throughout this ordeal, but realistic. In the back of our minds, we have known that HES, hypereosinophilic syndrome, as the true diagnosis was a possibility. But statistically speaking, it's nearly impossible due to her age. In 2015, it was a disease that only affected 2,000 people in the U.S., mostly adult men, but very few patients under the age of 5. The near impossibility of her having HES, plus the specialist's confidence that it was likely an external cause for the hypereosinophilia, gave me a slight glimmer of hope that this nightmare would be over soon. One that has been fading with every weekly blood draw. Finally, after all of these blood draws and 12 weeks of steroid treatment, we got a normal absolute eosinophil count of 400. We continued with weekly blood draws to keep an eye on her AEC levels to make sure that they don't skyrocket. We watched the trend as her body was no longer getting treatment. If we thought the past 2 months of weekly blood draws were nerve-wracking, waiting for these results was almost worse. Because it took so long for her levels to come back down near normal, then they started creeping up as the steroid dose was weaning. Every week I became less hopeful that the possibility of it being a fluke was even possible. But last week when they came down from 900 to 400, our first normal result ever, I was encouraged again. This downward trend in her absolute eosinophil count continued during the waiting period, even getting as low as 200. We started to get our hopes up that maybe this was a one-time fluke, until the final blood draw before heading to Cincinnati that dashed that glimmer of hope. We had a return visit to Cincinnati Children's scheduled for late September to have a repeat endoscopy to make sure that the steroid treatment eliminated the eosinophils from her esophagus, and for an appointment with her immunology specialist. We had a blood test and an appointment at the pediatrician's office for her first well visit all year due to this illness. My daughter needed a physical before the endoscopy and was supposed to get caught up on her vaccines. She missed her 18-month immunizations because she was on the heavy steroids, and steroids and vaccinations do not mix. Before her pediatrician left the room to get the nurse to give her the shot, I casually asked her what eosinophil numbers were from that morning's blood test. I wanted to make sure that everything was okay before they vaccinated her. She said they hadn't posted before she walked into the room, but she looked on her computer. I didn't have my glasses on, but I could see a bunch of red on the screen when she uploaded the test results. The doctor was quiet for a few minutes. Then she said that they had gone up a bit, to 1,600 from 200 2 weeks ago. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. She called her doctors in Cincinnati to weigh in on how to proceed. They said to go ahead with the vaccinations, and I guess they weren't immediately concerned about it. If they were, they would have held her off since you can't take steroids within a certain time frame of being vaccinated, and vice versa. So she got her shots. And they also blessed her with getting a flu shot during our visit with them on Wednesday. So we did. Her numbers have steadily increased from that day. We had a great time in Cincinnati. My daughter loved the aquarium and the zoo. She also had an awesome time playing on this gigantic playground under the interstate, getting ice cream, running around the shopping malls. The Embassy Suites we stayed at had a river running through it with koi fish and turtles. It also had a cave and a couple of waterfalls that she loved exploring. The hotel staff fell in love with our daughter and gave her stale dinner rolls to feed to the fish. The endoscopy came back clean, meaning no eosinophilic esophagitis, no elemental diets, no routine endoscopies, no esophagus stretching surgeries, and no permanent organ damage from the last bout. And another potential illness was officially crossed off the list, leaving us with the diagnosis of idiopathic hypereosinophilic syndrome. Praise the Lord for all of that. I realized that we were not alone in this hard place. Others have walked this road before us. Maybe not exactly the same road, since HES is extremely rare. I have a hard time finding support on the internet, and I felt so alone and isolated during that time. But parents have had sick children with uncertain futures. If He can give grace to those other parents, He can give grace to us. Christ says in Matthew 6 not to worry about our future because God provides for our today. So many of my fears are about my daughter's future, but God wants me to stop worrying about her future and to focus on what He's provided for our family today. And He'll continue to provide for us every day. The whole time during that 3-month period, I felt like our little family was stuck in a dark tunnel. Life continues happening on the outside of the tunnel for others. Traffic continues moving. From doctor's offices, to hospital rooms, to patient transfer corridors and elevators, to procedure prepping rooms, to operating rooms, to waiting rooms, to the lab. It felt like an endless tunnel from one place to the other. If you're stuck in a tunnel and you can't see the light of day, you're just stuck. My projects at work were stuck. My family expansion plans were stuck. Our home improvement plans were stuck. Our vacation plans were stuck. Our ministries at church were stuck. And I am very claustrophobic. With all the positive blood work numbers, I felt like I could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. However, since our counts have climbed back up, I felt like someone flipped off that light switch. It's all dark again. I got to thinking about God and the amazing grace He gives us. There are some who do not know God and are just wandering around through life in darkness, stuck in a tunnel. For those who do know God, see a light. Not necessarily a light at the end of the tunnel as the ending achievement of getting through the tunnel, but as a light to guide us through the tunnel so that way we can get out without banging our heads into the sidewalls. The light is God, and the goal for getting through the tunnel is to be in His light. We find heaven at the end of this tunnel. We find peace. But we trust God for guiding us along the way to that peace. My husband and I were pretty disappointed that this has come back. Well, it never really goes away, I guess, if it's in fact HES. We had hoped that this was a one-time fluke and it was gone for good. I had to literally fight tears in our pediatrician's office that morning. So we tried to stay busy and enjoy being our little family. We tried not to think about it. I was taking a shower one day and this line came back to me almost in a haunting way. God's got plans for those mystery kids. He ain't finished with her yet. It was something that the kind patient transport orderly told us as we wheeled her crib to get her heart echo done at Nationwide Children's. We made no mention of being Christians ourselves, but the orderly was exactly right. God's got special plans for my daughter. He is not finished with her yet. Considering Joseph's story in Genesis, Joseph spent time in prison not asking God why, but God what? We stopped ourselves short of lamenting, God, why? Committed ourselves to putting our trust in Him and our daughter's care in His loving hands. So instead of asking, God, why did this happen to our little girl? We asked, God, what do you want us to do with this circumstance? How does He want us to use this broken piece of our story for His glory? It is not time to sit back on my hands and worry about the future. It is time to get to work. Dear God, I come before you today with a heart full of gratitude and thanksgiving. I thank you for showing me how to be an advocate for my daughter's health and for guiding me through the challenges of navigating the healthcare system. Your wisdom and guidance have given me the strength to fight for her and to ensure that she receives the care and support she needs. I am also grateful for the somewhat diagnosis we have received at this point in our story. While we may not have had all the answers yet, I am thankful for the progress we made in understanding her health condition. Thank you for guiding the medical professionals involved in her care and for providing them with the knowledge and the expertise needed to help us find the right path forward. I pray that you will continue to be with us as we move forward, providing us with strength, patience, and resilience we need to face the challenges ahead. May your love and grace fill us with hope and peace, and may your healing touch bring comfort and relief to my daughter. Thank you for your blessings, your mercy, and your unfailing love. We trust in your guidance and wisdom, and we give you all the glory and honor. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Have you walked through an illness of a loved one? Have you walked through that dark valley yourself? How has God used that story to show you His glory? I would love to hear about it. You can send me an email to thestainedglasspodcast@gmail.com. I can read that story on the podcast anonymously, or you can come be on the podcast as a guest and tell us about it yourself. In the next episode, you will hear part 3 of this trilogy about how God showed us what to do next. It drops in 2 weeks. Until then, this has been Jessica Spurlock with the Stained Glass Podcast. Go be a blessing.